Before New York became a symbol of democracy, it was a battlefield. Before votes were counted, they were fought for. This is not a story about criminals hiding in the shadows. It's about a gang that ruled the streets in plain sight and turned politics into war. If you want to understand how power really works, how fear replaces law, and how history repeats itself, stay with us until the end. Subscribe, because this story doesn't belong in silence. In the first half of the 19th century, New York City was not yet the polished symbol of opportunity it would later sell to the world. It was loud, dirty, overcrowded, and deeply divided. The city was growing faster than its institutions, faster than its laws, faster than its ability to absorb the human tide flooding its streets. Every week, ships unloaded thousands of immigrants at its docks, most of them poor, desperate, and unfamiliar with the customs of the land they had entered. Among them, Irish Catholics fleeing famine and collapse arrived in staggering numbers, settling wherever rent was cheapest and resistance weakest. Neighborhoods like 5 Points became infamous almost overnight. To some, they were places of survival and community. To others, symbols of decay, crime, and moral collapse. Narrow alleys overflowed with bodies, languages, and desperation. Disease spread quickly, violence followed just as fast. And in the minds of many native-born Protestant workers, these new arrivals were not just competitors for jobs or housing. They were an existential threat to the America they believed belonged to them. This fear did not remain abstract. It hardened into resentment, then into ideology. Newspapers fanned the flames, portraying immigrants as criminals, drunks, or agents of foreign influence, loyal not to the United States, but to the Pope in Rome. Political speeches echoed the same message. America was under siege from within. The city became a pressure cooker of ethnic, religious, and economic anxiety, and the streets were where that pressure escaped. The Bowery district, stretching along one of Manhattan's main arteries, stood in stark contrast to 5 Points. It was rough, but it was orderly by comparison. It was the domain of skilled laborers, butchers, carpenters, shipbuilders, dockworkers, men who worked with their hands and prided themselves on physical strength and local reputation. Many were volunteer firemen, a role that carried immense prestige at a time when fires could erase entire blocks overnight. Fire companies were not just emergency services, they were social clubs, brotherhoods, and power centers. Out of this environment emerged the Bowery Boys. They did not begin as a criminal syndicate. They were not born in the shadows. They formed in the open, in firehouses, taverns, and street corners, bonded by shared identity rather than profit. What united them was a sense of ownership over their neighborhood and a belief that they were defending something pure against something invasive. They saw themselves as guardians of American values, even as those values were defined narrowly and violently. Their appearance mattered. In a city without uniforms of authority beyond the military, visibility was power. The Bowery Boys cultivated a distinctive look: stovepipe hats worn at a defiant angle, red shirts that announced their presence from blocks away, dark trousers, heavy boots built for standing ground and charging forward. This was not fashion. It was intimidation, recognition, and unity woven into fabric. When a group of Bowery Boys walked down a street, no explanation was needed. Everyone knew who they were and what side they represented. As the city's institutions lagged behind its growth, informal power filled the gap. Policing was inconsistent, often corrupt, and frequently partisan. Courts were slow and selective. In this vacuum, groups like the Bowery Boys became de facto authorities. They settled disputes, protected their businesses, and enforced unwritten rules of territory. To their supporters, they were order. To their enemies, they were terror. But beneath the surface of neighborhood pride lay something more dangerous: the fusion of identity with violence. The Bowery Boys did not merely dislike immigrants, they defined themselves in opposition to them. Every clash, every brawl, every street confrontation reinforced a narrative of us versus them. The city became a map of invisible borders, each one defended by fists, clubs, and fire. What made the Bowery Boys uniquely powerful was timing. Their rise coincided with the politicization of the street itself. Voting was not a private act. Ballots were cast publicly, at physical locations, often without secrecy or protection. Whoever controlled the path to the polls controlled democracy in practice, regardless of what the law promised on paper. Political actors quickly realized that influence did not require persuasion alone. It required muscle. At first, the Bowery Boys were spontaneous. Their violence erupted in reaction to perceived slights or threats, but as their reputation grew, so did their utility. They were organized, they were disciplined, they could mobilize quickly, and most importantly, they believed they were justified. This sense of moral certainty made them far more dangerous than common criminals. They did not see themselves as breaking the social order. They believed they were preserving it. By the late 1830s and 1840s, the Bowery Boys had become a recognizable force in New York's public life. They attended parades en masse. They dominated certain streets by sheer presence. They clashed openly with rival ethnic gangs, especially Irish groups who were forming their own networks of protection and retaliation. Each confrontation deepened divisions, turning neighborhoods into front lines. This was the moment when New York crossed a threshold. Political disagreement, economic competition, and cultural anxiety fused into something combustible. The Bowery Boys were not the cause of this transformation. They were its most visible symptom. They embodied the city's failure to reconcile explosive growth with inclusive governance. By the end of this chapter, one truth becomes unavoidable. The Bowery Boys were not an anomaly. They were the logical outcome of a city that allowed fear to replace dialogue and force to replace law. Their story begins not with crime, but with identity, and it is this foundation that will allow them, in the chapters ahead, to turn elections into battlefields and politics into street war. If fear was the soil that gave birth to the Bowery Boys, organization was the structure that allowed them to grow into something far more dangerous. By the 1840s, New York was no longer a city governed primarily by law. It was governed by presence. Authority was not always written, but it was always felt. And nowhere was that authority more visible than in the firehouses scattered across Manhattan. Volunteer fire companies were among the most respected institutions of the time. Fires were frequent and catastrophic, capable of erasing entire neighborhoods in a single night. Firemen were admired as heroes, men who ran toward chaos while others fled. But these companies were also intensely competitive, territorial, and political. They fought for prestige, funding, and recognition. In many cases, they fought each other before ever fighting a fire. For the Bowery Boys, the firehouse became more than a place of service. It became a headquarters. Inside those brick buildings, loyalty was forged through shared danger and ritual. New recruits were tested not by paperwork, but by endurance, obedience, and willingness to stand with the group in confrontation. A man who could be trusted in a fire could be trusted in a fight. This overlap between civic duty and street violence blurred moral lines, giving the Bowery Boys a legitimacy few gangs could claim. They were not hiding from society, they were embedded within it. Uniformity played a crucial role in this transformation. The Bowery Boys understood something instinctively that modern movements would later perfect. Identity must be visible to be powerful. Their clothing was not accidental or purely cultural, it was deliberate signaling. The stovepipe hat elevated height and presence. The red shirt cut through crowds and chaos. Heavy boots were practical weapons as much as footwear. Together, they created a collective silhouette that announced control before a word was spoken. This visual discipline did something profound. It replaced individuality with unity. A Bowery Boy was not acting alone. He was acting as part of a body. When violence occurred, responsibility dissolved into the group, making retaliation harder and fear more effective. Witnesses did not describe men. They described a force moving through the street. Training, though informal, was constant. Physical labor built strength, fire drills built coordination, street confrontations refined tactics. Over time, the Bowery Boys learned how to move together, how to hold a line, how to surround opponents, and how to retreat without collapsing into panic. These were not drunken brawls, they were rehearsals. As policing remained weak and fragmented, the Bowery Boys filled the gap. They controlled access to certain streets. They decided who could operate businesses without harassment. They enforced curfews that existed only by reputation. In neighborhoods under their influence, safety depended less on law than on allegiance. Residents learned quickly which symbols meant protection and which meant danger. What distinguished the Bowery Boys from other street groups was their sense of purpose. They did not fight merely for profit or pleasure. They fought for dominance of space and narrative. Every confrontation reinforced their claim to the Bowery as a native stronghold, a place where outsiders were tolerated only at the group's discretion. Violence became a language, a way of communicating boundaries more effectively than words ever could. This is where the gang began to resemble a militia. Militias historically emerge when communities believe formal institutions can no longer protect them. The Bowery Boys framed themselves in exactly this way. They claimed that police were ineffective, that politicians were corrupt, and that immigrant gangs threatened public order. Whether these claims were true mattered less than whether they were believed. Among many working-class Protestants, they were. Political actors took notice. A group capable of mobilizing dozens of disciplined men, already accustomed to confrontation and unafraid of public visibility, was an asset too valuable to ignore. Informal relationships formed between Bowery leaders and local power brokers. No contracts were signed, no speeches were made. Understanding traveled quietly. When force was needed, the Bowery Boys could deliver it. This relationship accelerated their militarization. Street fights became strategic deployments. Patrols became organized presence. The gang learned when to appear and when to disappear, when to escalate and when to hold back. They were no longer reacting to events, they were shaping them. Crucially, the Bowery Boys maintained a sense of moral righteousness throughout this evolution. They did not view themselves as criminals. They saw themselves as citizens taking responsibility where the state had failed. This belief insulated them from guilt and justified increasing brutality. Violence was not a breakdown of order, it was the restoration of it. By the mid-1840s, the Bowery Boys were no longer just defending territory. They were defending influence. Their presence at parades, rallies, and public gatherings sent a clear message. Certain ideas would be protected, others would be crushed. Opponents did not need to be silenced by law, they could be silenced by fear. Firehouses, once symbols of safety, became symbols of power projection. Uniforms became psychological weapons. Brotherhood became obedience. The transformation was subtle but irreversible. What began as neighborhood solidarity hardened into organized coercion. This chapter marks a turning point. The Bowery Boys had crossed from social group to force multiplier. They were ready to be used, and the city was ready to use them. In the next chapter, that readiness would collide with the most fragile institution of all, the vote. By the time the Bowery Boys had fully transformed into a disciplined street force, New York's political system was already dangerously exposed. Democracy in the mid-19th century did not resemble the controlled, bureaucratic process people imagine today. Voting was physical. It happened in the open. Polling places were crowded rooms or street-level locations where men gathered publicly to declare their choice. There were no privacy booths, no standardized ballots, and little protection for those who dared to vote against the dominant force controlling the neighborhood. In this environment, Politics was not won through persuasion alone. It was won by who could stand their ground. Elections became events where tension was expected, not feared. Crowds gathered early, rumors spread quickly. Men arrived in groups, already aligned, already prepared. The presence of a gang could determine whether an entire block voted or stayed home in silence. This is where the Bowery Boys found their most powerful role, not as spontaneous fighters, but as instruments of political control. Their arrival at polling locations was rarely subtle. Red shirts and stovepipe hats cut through the crowd like warning signs. Their posture communicated everything before a single word was spoken. They did not need to announce who they supported. Everyone already knew. Their job was not to debate policy, but to shape the environment in which voting occurred. Intimidation was often enough. When it wasn't, violence followed. Ballot boxes were overturned, polling stations were stormed, lines were broken apart with clubs and fists. Immigrant voters, particularly Irish Catholics, quickly learned that participating could carry real consequences. A man might survive election day only to be targeted later that night. Homes were known, taverns were watched. Memory on the street was long. What made this violence uniquely corrosive was its selective nature. The Bowery Boys did not attack indiscriminately. They targeted with intent. Their goal was not chaos, but outcome. If enough opposition voters were discouraged, injured, or frightened away, the result was secured without the need to silence everyone. Fear became a precision tool. Political leaders understood this dynamic, even if they never acknowledged it publicly. Elections in New York were often decided not by margins of ideology, but by margins of endurance. Who was willing to show up when showing up meant risking injury? Who had protection on the street, and who did not? The Bowery Boys provided an answer to these questions long before ballots were counted. For many working-class Protestants, the gang's actions were framed as defensive. They were protecting elections from foreign influence. They were preserving American values against corruption. This narrative allowed supporters to rationalize brutality as civic duty. Violence was not a betrayal of democracy, it was its enforcement. Opposition groups responded in kind. Immigrant communities began organizing their own street protection, forming rival gangs that mirrored the Bowery Boys in structure and purpose. What followed was escalation. Election days became flashpoints where weeks of tension exploded into hours of open conflict. Streets filled with shouting, running bodies, and shattered glass. Police, when present, often chose sides or arrived too late to matter. In some districts, elections effectively ceased to function. Voting was symbolic at best, impossible at worst. Entire populations were politically erased not by law, but by fear. This was democracy hollowed out from the inside, its rituals intact, but its meaning stripped away. The Bowery Boys thrived in this environment because it validated everything they believed about power. They saw proof that strength shaped reality more effectively than argument. Each successful election reinforced their relevance. Each defeated opponent confirmed their necessity. The street had become the true arena of governance. Crucially, the gang did not operate in isolation. Their actions were tolerated, excused, or quietly encouraged by political factions that benefited from the outcomes. When violence delivered victory, questions were not asked. Investigations stalled. Arrests were minimal or temporary. The message was clear, even if unspoken. Force worked. This period marked a turning point not only for the Bowery Boys, but for New York itself. Politics ceased to be merely divisive and became openly adversarial. Ideological disagreement translated directly into physical threat. The city learned to expect blood alongside ballots. For ordinary residents, this reality produced exhaustion and resignation. Many stopped believing their participation mattered. Others aligned themselves with whichever group offered protection, regardless of ideology. Political identity became inseparable from survival. Neutrality disappeared. By the late 1840s and early 1850s, the Bowery Boys had cemented their reputation as election enforcers. Their presence could swing outcomes. Their absence could invite chaos. They had become indispensable to a system that publicly condemned violence while privately relying on it. This chapter reveals a fundamental truth. Once violence becomes a legitimate political tool, it reshapes every institution it touches. Voting no longer measures will, it measures fear. Law no longer governs outcomes, power does. And the Bowery Boys were learning that the more indispensable they became, the harder it would be for the city to ever remove them. In the next chapter, this cycle of intimidation and retaliation would break containment. What began at polling stations would spill into the streets in full daylight, transforming political rivalry into open urban warfare. What began as intimidation at polling stations could not remain contained. Violence, once normalized as a political tool, has a way of escaping its original purpose. By the early 1850s, New York crossed a point of no return. Elections were no longer the only battleground. Entire neighborhoods became fronts in an undeclared urban war. As the Bowery Boys tightened their grip on territory and political influence, immigrant communities learned a brutal lesson. Waiting for protection from the state was futile. Police forces were fragmented, underfunded, and often aligned with local power structures. Courts moved slowly, if at all. Survival demanded self-organization. Out of this necessity emerged rival gangs, most notably Irish groups centered around 5 points, including the Dead Rabbits. These were not merely criminal associations, they were defensive coalitions formed under constant threat. Their purpose mirrored that of the Bowery Boys, but from the opposite side of the city's cultural divide. Where the Bowery Boys claimed to protect Native America, these gangs fought for the right to exist at all. The result was escalation. Street confrontations became larger, more coordinated, and more destructive. No longer limited to fistfights or isolated brawls, clashes involved dozens, sometimes hundreds of men. Clubs, bricks, knives, and improvised weapons filled the streets. Barricades were erected using wagons, crates, and debris. Alleys became ambush corridors. Rooftops turned into observation posts. For ordinary residents, daily life dissolved into uncertainty. Streets that were safe in the morning could become lethal by nightfall. Shops closed early. Families avoided certain routes entirely. Children learned to recognize colors, symbols, and accents that signaled danger. Neutrality was no longer an option. You belonged to a side, or you suffered for not choosing one. What made this violence particularly devastating was its persistence. These were not isolated riots sparked by single events. They were recurring eruptions in a long-running conflict. Each clash carried memory. Each injury demanded revenge. Each death hardened identities further. The city's geography became layered with invisible scars, places where blood had been spilled and scores remained unsettled. The Bowery Boys adapted quickly to this new reality. Their experience in organized movement and group discipline gave them an advantage in sustained conflict. They did not rely solely on rage. They relied on coordination. Lines were held. Retreats were calculated. Reinforcements arrived on cue. Firehouses once again served as staging grounds, places to regroup, arm themselves, and plan the next move. Irish gangs responded with equal ferocity. Numbers became a weapon. Familiarity with the labyrinthine streets of 5 Points allowed for rapid dispersal and surprise attacks. Violence became cyclical, almost ritualistic. A beating here would trigger a counterattack there. No single victory lasted long enough to secure peace. Authorities watched as the situation deteriorated. When they intervened, it was often to suppress symptoms rather than causes. Arrests were made, but selectively. Leaders were rarely held long enough to matter. In some cases, police units avoided confrontations altogether. unwilling or unable to face organized crowds. The absence of decisive enforcement sent a clear message: the street would decide its own rules. One of the most disturbing aspects of this period was how normalized the chaos became. Newspapers reported clashes with grim regularity, often framing them as inevitable outcomes of rough districts rather than failures of governance. Middle and upper-class citizens read about the violence as spectacle, distant from their own lives, while entire neighborhoods lived under constant siege. Political actors continued to benefit from this disorder. A divided city was easier to manipulate. As long as gangs fought each other, attention was diverted from those who quietly profited from the instability. Violence served as both distraction and enforcement, ensuring that real power remained untouched. For the Bowery Boys, the street war validated their worldview. They believed the city was dangerous because enemies made it so, and that only strength could impose order. Each riot confirmed their necessity. Each rival attack justified harsher retaliation. Moral boundaries eroded quickly. What had once been framed as defense increasingly resembled domination. The human cost was immense. Lives were lost over street corners that held no inherent value. Families were displaced. Entire blocks fell into cycles of destruction and rebuilding. Trust between communities collapsed, replaced by suspicion passed down through generations. By the mid-1850s, New York resembled a city at war with itself. Not a formal war with declarations and treaties, but a constant low-intensity conflict embedded in daily life. Politics, ethnicity, and territory were inseparable. Violence was no longer exceptional, it was structural. This chapter marks the moment when the Bowery Boys ceased to be merely political enforcers and became central actors in a broader urban conflict. The street was no longer a means to influence elections, it was the primary arena of power. Yet even in chaos, patterns emerge. As the next chapter will reveal, those at the top were learning how to harness this violence more efficiently, transforming uncontrolled street war into managed force. The gangs would not disappear, they would be absorbed. When New York descended into near-constant street warfare, the most powerful figures in the city did not rush to stop it. Instead, they observed. Chaos, after all, is not always an enemy of power. In many cases, it is an opportunity. By the mid-19th century, formal political institutions in New York had learned an uncomfortable truth. They could not fully control the streets, but they could influence those who did. Gangs like the Bowery Boys were no longer anomalies to be suppressed. They were realities to be managed. And for ambitious political operators, management meant alignment. This is where violence began to change character. Rather than erupting unpredictably, street force became selective, strategic, and increasingly tied to political outcomes. Leaders within gangs established quiet channels of communication with ward bosses, campaign organizers, and intermediaries who never appeared in public records. No contracts were signed, no official orders were given. The understanding was implicit: protection and privilege in exchange for loyalty and results. Few organizations embodied this dynamic more effectively than Tammany Hall, the democratic political machine that dominated New York politics for decades. Tammany Hall did not invent corruption or street violence, but it perfected the system of absorbing both into a coherent structure of power. It recognized that elections could be won not only by mobilizing voters, but by controlling the conditions under which voting occurred. Gangs became part of that infrastructure. For the Bowery Boys, this relationship marked a profound transformation. They were no longer merely reacting to threats or defending territory. They were being deployed. Their presence at certain locations on certain days was no coincidence. Their absence elsewhere was equally deliberate. Violence was no longer just a show of dominance. It was a signal, a message sent on behalf of interests that preferred to remain unseen. In return, the Bowery Boys received something more valuable than money: protection. Arrests became temporary inconveniences. Charges were dropped or quietly reduced. Judges showed leniency. Police interference softened. Fire companies linked to the gang received favorable treatment, equipment, and prestige. The line between civic service and political enforcement blurred almost completely. This arrangement created a dangerous feedback loop. The more useful the Bowery Boys became to political machines, the more indispensable they appeared. Their actions shaped outcomes, and outcomes justified their continued existence. Violence ceased to be a problem to solve and became a resource to allocate. What made this system especially resilient was plausible deniability. When riots erupted or voters were intimidated, political leaders could publicly condemn the disorder while privately benefiting from it. Gangs operated in the open, but responsibility remained diffuse. Everyone knew what was happening, yet no one was officially accountable. For ordinary citizens, this realization was devastating. It meant that appeals to law were futile. Justice was not blind, it was selective. Power did not flow upward from the people, it circulated among those who already held it, enforced by men whose loyalty was bought with silence and protection. Within the Bowery Boys, internal dynamics shifted as well. Leadership became more centralized. Decisions were less spontaneous and more calculated. Younger members learned quickly that advancement came not only from bravery, but from reliability. A man who followed instructions precisely was more valuable than one who acted on impulse. Discipline tightened. The gang began to resemble an unofficial arm of governance. This did not eliminate internal conflict. Some members resisted the loss of autonomy, resenting the idea that their defense of American values was now serving political elites. Others embraced the new order, understanding that proximity to power offered longevity. These tensions foreshadowed future fractures, but for the moment, the alliance held. Meanwhile, rival gangs were drawn into similar arrangements. Irish groups aligned with their own political patrons, creating parallel systems of protection and enforcement. What emerged was not a breakdown of governance, but an alternative form of it, one where ballots, favors, and violence were interchangeable currencies. The city functioned, but on distorted terms. Infrastructure expanded, businesses operated, elections continued. Yet beneath the surface, outcomes were negotiated through intimidation as much as persuasion. The public rituals of democracy masked a deeper truth. Power was being brokered in taverns, firehouses, and backrooms, enforced on the street. For the Bowery Boys, this period represented their peak influence. They were feared by enemies, tolerated by authorities, and valued by political patrons. They had achieved what few street groups ever do: institutional relevance. Removing them would have destabilized the very systems that relied on their presence. But systems built on coercion carry inherent limits. As the city grew wealthier and more complex, pressure mounted for reform, professionalization, and control. Middle and upper-class citizens, increasingly alarmed by open disorder, began demanding stability over spectacle. Calls for modern policing and legal reform grew louder. The very success of the Bowery Boys contained the seeds of their decline. They had helped demonstrate that violence could shape politics. Now, political elites began asking whether that violence could be replaced with something more predictable. The question was no longer whether gangs were useful, but whether they were too visible, too uncontrollable, too costly to maintain. This chapter reveals the most unsettling truth of all. The Bowery Boys did not corrupt New York politics from the outside. They were invited in, they were integrated, and for a time, they worked exactly as intended. In the final chapter, that invitation will be withdrawn. The city will attempt to professionalize force, rewrite the rules of control, and erase the very gangs that helped it survive an earlier era. But as history will show, models of power rarely disappear. They evolve. By the late 1850s, New York was changing again. The same forces that had allowed gangs like the Bowery Boys to thrive were now being challenged by a growing demand for order, predictability, and centralized control. The city had grown too large, too valuable, and too interconnected to tolerate permanent street warfare. What had once been a rough but functional balance between chaos and influence began to look like a liability. Reform did not arrive suddenly. It crept in through policy, infrastructure, and professionalization. One of the most decisive shifts was the strengthening of formal law enforcement, particularly the emergence of what would become the New York City Police Department. Unlike earlier, loosely organized watch systems, this force was centralized, salaried, and increasingly insulated from neighborhood loyalties. The goal was clear: remove the monopoly of violence from the street and place it firmly in the hands of the state. For the Bowery Boys, this shift was existential. Their power had always depended on visibility and proximity. They controlled blocks, polling places, and firehouses because no stronger authority consistently challenged them. As policing became more systematic and reforms tightened oversight, that space began to shrink. Arrests carried more weight. Detentions lasted longer. Tolerance eroded. At the same time, the city's political machinery evolved. Political bosses learned that overt street violence, once useful, now threatened legitimacy and economic growth. Investors, merchants, and middle-class voters demanded stability. Riots scared capital. Disorder embarrassed the city on a national stage. The same elites who once benefited from gang enforcement now sought quieter, cleaner methods of control. The Bowery Boys found themselves increasingly exposed. Internal fractures widened. Without guaranteed protection, loyalty weakened. Younger members questioned the value of risking injury or imprisonment for diminishing returns. Older leaders struggled to adapt to a world where brute presence no longer guaranteed influence. Fire companies were professionalized. Uniforms lost their psychological edge. The street no longer belonged exclusively to them. Some Bowery Boys drifted into obscurity, blending back into working-class life. Others were absorbed into new forms of authority, police forces, political operatives, or labor organizations, carrying with them the tactics and mentality forged in earlier conflicts. A few resisted, clinging to old methods, only to be crushed by a system now strong enough to enforce its will. By the 1860s, the Bowery Boys as a coherent force had effectively disappeared. No dramatic final battle marked their end. No official decree dissolved them. They faded as relevance faded, a quiet disappearance that made their impact easy to forget. But forgetting them would be a mistake, because while the Bowery Boys vanished, their blueprint endured. They had demonstrated something fundamental about power in a mass city: that identity-based mobilization, disciplined street presence, and strategic intimidation could reshape political outcomes. They proved that democracy could be influenced not only through ideas, but through control of physical space. They revealed how informal violence could be integrated into formal systems and later discarded when no longer convenient. This pattern would repeat itself across history. Later urban gangs would adopt similar structures, uniforms, and territorial logic. Political movements, both radical and reactionary, would learn to weaponize crowds, symbols, and fear. Even modern states would internalize lessons first tested in the streets of 19th century New York. Visibility matters, loyalty matters, and force, when selectively applied, can shape reality faster than persuasion. The Bowery Boys were not an aberration of a lawless past. They were an early expression of a recurring dynamic in urban politics. Whenever institutions fail to mediate fear, whenever identity hardens into exclusion, and whenever power seeks shortcuts, the street becomes a tool again. Their story also exposes a deeper, discomforting truth. The Bowery Boys did not emerge because New York lacked values. They emerged because values collided without mechanisms to resolve them peacefully. The city chose containment over inclusion, muscle over mediation. In doing so, it created its own enforcers and later pretended they had never been necessary. In the end, the Bowery Boys did not lose a war. The war simply changed form. The uniforms disappeared, but organized intimidation did not. Firehouses lost their political role, but other institutions took its place. The faces changed, the language evolved, but the logic remained. Control the street, and you influence the system. As New York marched toward modernity, it buried the memory of the Bowery Boys beneath narratives of progress and reform. Yet the echoes linger in every moment when politics spills into physical confrontation, when belonging is defined by exclusion, and when power is enforced rather than earned. Their legacy is not found in monuments or plaques. It lives in the uncomfortable realization that the line between civic order and street violence has never been as firm as we like to believe. And once crossed, it is never truly erased.